Hello guys, today we are going to be starting with a new project on AWS Lambda, and we are going to be particularly looking at automating a task using AWS Lambda. First of all, what we are going to do is we are going to check what the difficulty level is going to be. The difficulty level going to be is intermediate. To do this project, you must have the following skill sets. You should have some knowledge about AWS S3 in particular, and you should also have some basic understanding of Python concepts. Along with the troubleshooting concepts will be very helpful to you while going through this particular project. Next up, project objective. Participants will be able to implement AWS Lambda functions in Python, AWS Lambda triggers. Now AWS Lambda has functions and triggers as well. So functions and triggers are attributes of AWS Lambda, and we'll learn how to work with both of them. Second thing, what will you learn in this project? Articulate what is serverless computing, and the second thing is identify the value of serverless computing. So basically AWS Lambda is used for making a serverless infrastructure, and we are going to be looking at how is this useful in real life projects via this. AWS Lambda usage, as I mentioned, and the usage of API gateway. In this project we are going to be using API gateways, Lambda and Python, so that is the reason why I'm telling you that you will be able to learn API gateways as well. Moving on, are there any project requirements or prerequisites? Yes, there are. You should have basic understanding of AWS services at a very beginner's level, AWS S3 in particular, as I mentioned earlier, and also some knowledge about API gateways will be very useful. Next, who are the target students here? Participants working on DevOps or operations role. Also, any person who is interested in learning or creating serverless infrastructure can benefit from this particular project. Moving on, by the end of this project, you will have the following skill sets: hands-on regarding practical and real-life scenarios of creating serverless infrastructure, because the project which we are going to be looking at is going to be a real-life project, and a particular problem statement which you might encounter in a day-to-day corporate level. How to create different Lambda functions, yes, and last thing we are going to be checking is how to trigger that Lambda function using multiple triggers. Okay, now coming to the project contents, we are going to be looking at how to approach serverless computing, achieving serverless architecture using AWS Lambda, and AWS Lambda functions with Python. And as and when we keep on triggering these particular Lambda functions written in Python, we can also monitor the triggers and the output it generates using AWS CloudWatch. Okay, now we are going to be coming to the case study about this particular project. First, I'll read out the entire case study statement and then I'll explain it to you, which is not mentioned in the case study. A DevOps engineer at a IT firm has built an efficient development team that specializes in automating infrastructures. Currently, his team has a particular set of code which is not used as often. However, the engineer wants this code to be executed every time so that an output is produced as and when expected using an API call. Now, as a part of this team, you have been assigned this task to automate the process using AWS Lambda and AWS API Gateway. Now, let me break this thing down. Suppose you have a team in your company which wants you to run a particular code as and when it is required. So, for example, let's say they have some process going on in the background in the infrastructure which makes an API call for a particular code, but it is not like frequent. Okay, it is only on demand, and that is the reason why they don't want to have any dedicated EC2 instances for that. So in that case, you will incorporate serverless infrastructure and you are going to incorporate it using AWS Lambda. And API gateway also has been mentioned because there is this API which has been called. So whenever this particular API from API gateway is being called, AWS Lambda function should be triggering, and the Python function or the Python program mentioned in the AWS Lambda should work or should run. I think I made the case study very clear. If you are still a little confused, you can go through this slide and get a better understanding of it. Okay. So following scenario will be covered as a part of this case study. Creating your own AWS Lambda function, configuring trigger on those functions, creating AWS API gateway get and post methods, and using API gateway to trigger the Lambda functions. Okay, so I think that's it for now, and let's get started.